We will now head straight on to Sarah Wilson, as we are a bit running behind our scheme. Sarah, podium is yours. Sarah will introduce 2 Polish artists in 2 exhibitions in London to us.
Okay, right. Yes, I'm going to present to you today 2 Polish artists, one of whom, Marcin Dudek. His exhibition Steps and Marches was in the Edel Assanti Gallery in London in 2017. He actually lives and works in Brussels. And Ewa Axelrad, whose exhibition Shtama was presented at Copperfield Gallery, again run by a former courtauld art historian, at exactly the same time in November 2017. Axelrad is a Polish artist living in London, as so many Polish people do. And her work, Shtama, the word means boys' solidarity or group aggression. Next slide, please. This is the installation of Marcin Dudek's show, to which I'll return. 2 art exhibitions curated as installations with remarkable and complementary poetics, entirely separate from the political propaganda, media images, and their mediation, which is part of the material with which they work. Next one, please. I first saw Ewa's work at a remarkable exhibition at the Hannah Barry Gallery, some of you may know, in Peckham Rye car park. I came to it at sunset, where her papier-mâché recreations of the lions in Trafalgar Square gave me, because precisely of their scale, a visceral sense of recognition. I'm going to talk a lot about the visceral, that gut feeling in my talk. So I thought, who is this? And that's how I discovered Ewa Axelrad. Next slide, please. Only last week, the Polish ambassador to the UK, Arkady Rzyzgowski, I don't pronounce his name properly, begged Poles in the Guardian newspaper after his radio interview to seriously consider leaving the UK. There were 832,000 Polish people living in the UK in 2018. 116,000 have already left, but only 27% have been worried enough to register for their new kind of settled status legitimacy in the terrible contemporary Brexit climate. And because, of course, you know what we're all going to be talking about, just to show you, next slide please, the Ai Weiwei installation combining with Frieze art fair in London at this very moment, where out of Lego pieces he's created monumental acknowledgements, not tributes, but world publicity. Again, this is just simply the front page of the report about, whoops, I didn't mean go on, but anyway, that the Ai Weiwei, The Ai Weiwei was the corroborated report of Russian interference in the American elections. Okay, next one, please. So, of course, here we get to the evil genius of Cambridge Analytica, the CEO of whom, Alexander Nix, surprise, surprise, also went to Eton, along with David Cameron and Boris Johnson, the very famous boys' public school, which teaches men to rule empire, although in the present digital climate, they get a bit out of their depth, of course. And its logo was if I point, I don't mean next one. If I wiggle my finger, I mean next one, okay? I'm pointing to this. This is the logo of Cambridge Analytica, which looks both like a network and a brain, which has been adopted by an anti-Cambridge Analytica thing to show you honey traps, in his case promising beautiful Ukrainian girls to people, grossly unethical, illegal data mining, so on and so forth. And he is wearing the English poppy here, which commemorates the First World War, which is showing that he's a member of the establishment as well. Very particular. Okay, next slide, please. This is my heroine, along with Gina Miller, Carol Cadwalla, the Guardian journalist who exposed Cambridge Analytica only 1 year ago. She's been reflecting on the current situation. You can see that there is this established criminal electoral fraud, which for some reason the judiciary do not pursue. that the whistleblowers, we've had that word twice now, there are two in this case, Christopher Wiley and Shamir Sanini, two young men who faced a lot of personal threats, have not been given proper media coverage, including by the BBC. And of course, there's the whole Nigel Farage links to Steve Bannon and Trump and so forth. And what is interesting from a kind of mythological point of view is that, next one please, is that in 2018, before now, the figure who had no face, Dominic Cummings, the media genius behind Cambridge Analytica, had already, if you like, become art, thanks to Benedict Cumberbatch, playing him in the film called The Uncivil War. Incidentally, there is a kind of class issue here as well, because while Dominic Cummings also went to Oxford, he did not go to Eton and did not go to the right college, and there's a master-servant dialectic here. He went to Brasenose, he doesn't wear the right clothes, going on between Johnson and him, to which I will return. So truth into art before he revealed his face, because if I could have the next one, please. Dominic Johnson is now revealed as the devil behind the dunce. You see the dunce is capped with a D, the dunce Johnson. So there is this who is King Lear, who is the fool, age-old scenario going on. But of course the stakes, despite, as we've said today, the carnivalesque aspect, are very, very serious. I was interested in this, at least in 2015, I started to go into the kind of intellectual history of thinking about crowds and populism. So I'm going to have a quick whoosh to get back to my two poles, if you will allow me, simply because the progression is very interesting and involves art history, our discipline. Next slide, please. Of course, everyone knows this very, very famous frontispiece to Hobbes' Leviathan of 1651, where the benign monarch or sovereign actually contains the mass of citizen subjects who are incorporated, literally brought into his body to create the body politic. But the important thing to point out is this was created at the time of the English Civil War, a mirror for our times, with class against class, and interestingly enough, Protestants against Catholics, and the austerity of severe Puritanism against the extravagant display of formerly Catholic aristocrats. So you see how it goes on. So if we get to the next British thought about this, this is rather interesting. Next one, please. This is hopping to a Scot, actually. 1841, Charles Mackay, Extraordinary Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Now, this is not the subject of Hobbes, which was about the structure of legitimate government. It's about how irrationality comes in. It's about the crazes for tulips, burning witches, if you think that that was irrational at the time. The South Sea bubble, huge investment in something that didn't exist, a group think, and so forth. So going on, when we get to the idea of after the invention of the discipline of psychology, the study of the psyche, next one please, we get Gustave Le Bon, his Psychology of the Crowd, widely of course translated in 1895. But what I came to discover is that in almost each case, these intellectuals who'd written about crowd psychology were people who'd personally experienced the visceral horror of seeing rampaging crowds, in his case not only the Franco-Prussian War, but the conflagrations of Paris at the time of the Commune, the communards setting fire to the Tuileries and so forth. And of course, once he'd written the book, it was immediately taken up. Guess who? By the military, with their idea of creating the ideal esprit du corps, the fighting body, and by the early discipline of criminology as well. Next one, please. Now we get into in the modern period, George Sorel's reflections on violence came from the position of someone who was a revolutionary syndicalist in class struggle and revolution, and his book was very important for the futurists, as I'll show you, whereas re-editions in 1921 and 1937 were important for Walter Benjamin. So if we could just have the next, I know I'm slightly off target for 1 second, but I think this is very interesting. If you compare these two Italian paintings, you have Giuseppe Palizza de Volpetto's fourth estate of the March of the proletariat claiming its rights, but the almost algorithmic description of the psyche kind of transcending the form in Carlo Carra's Funerist of the Anarchist Galley, where protesters at a funeral had encountered a lot of police brutality and so forth, and become weaponized and so forth. But it's interesting how what I was taught was simply futurist lines of force are actually really at this very turn of the century describing a kind of algorithmic logo that is transcending individual things. And they were inspired by Jules Romain, a French poet, his idea of unanimisme, from which stems the word unanimously, thinking with one mind. So it's interesting to go back to this beginning of modernism. And then in terms of those re-editions of Sorel, the next two please, if you look at the popular front processions of 1935, everybody was joyously behaving themselves, tracing their protests into a lineage going back to Voltaire and Courbet from a painter's point of view to Paul Signac, who is still on the cards. And yet, 2 years later, and in fact all the time, these joyous demonstrations, I liked very much the idea of tipping this morning, were tipping into violence. And here we have an aerial view, maybe from a police archive, of protests in 1937 to do with, again, the victim of police brutality, where Walter Benjamin writes, and this is a nice change from going on and on and on about reproduction in 1936. He writes for a critique of violence in 21 and his thoughts on a critique of violence in this context of 37, where he asks when and under what conditions a legal action must convert itself into an illegal action and an illegal action into a violent act. So 3 more blokes to go before I get back to my 2 Polish exhibitions. Next 2, please. These ones of absolutely massive importance. On the left, your own Berliner, Willi Münzenberg, who moved with the burning of the Reichstag to Paris to direct the world communist Comintern propaganda movement. As far as we're talking about world operations of Cambridge Analytica and so forth, this was about as ambitious as you could get, the Soviet Comintern thing which percolated every form of new media, press, film, and so forth. Willi Münzenberg was, of course, a very initially noble anti-fascist who in the end renounced Stalin, and having published this book, Propaganda as a Weapon, in France by the Édition du Carrefour. In France, he was murdered, and it was faked suicide in 1940. Now, this book coming out in France in 1937 was very important for another Soviet émigré, Sergei Chakotine, whose book here, in French, Le viol des foules par la propagande politique, means the rape of the crowds by political propaganda. This was immediately pulped when the Nazis invaded Paris. But what's interesting here in terms of these different disciplines coming together to study how to mind rape is that he wrote this critical, obviously, book as someone who trained as a biologist under Pavlov in the Soviet School of Reflexology. So he's bringing that to bear on this issue of, if you like, mind rape, but actually in English it was called The Psychology of Totalitarian Propaganda. So last person who gives his title to my talk, Elias Canetti, his Crowds and Power, which came out in the 60s and was curiously anthropological, I thought, when I read it, was actually a kind of very bulked out intellectual anthropological reflection, which was in fact inspired by his witnessing of Nazi demonstrations in Vienna when he was very much younger, which had fed into his first novel, which was called, previous page, Die Blendung, about mob action, group thinking, and individual pathologies. So interestingly enough, if we come forward into the kind of childhood, next one please, book reading, that was going on for Ewa Axelrad, my second Polish artist, in post-war Poland, and now I understand post-war Germany, William Golding's Lord of the Flies, about what happens when you get a group of isolated adolescent boys and you leave them in a place together in a very anarchical, unhierarchical way. was very important for Ewa Axelrad. And her thinking as a TV serial as well in Poland. And of course, finally, another of my very big academic heroes, still so little known in some fields, Klaus Theweleit, who comes from, as you know very well, the German situation and publishes this important book dealing with the Nazi past. I'm going very quickly. I hope I'm not to offend people by my quick summaries, about male fantasies and what we now call the construction of masculinity. This has had a huge impact in humanities disciplines, such as, you know, English literature and the poetry of the First World War. But unfortunately, while toxic masculinity is today's phrase, and obviously is the dialectical other of the Me Too movement, it has not percolated his lessons, his thought, the thoughts of the British political establishment. So back to Marcin Dudek. Next one, please. And what is so interesting about him is he began in Poland as a poor boy who was a football supporter of the Polish Cracovia football team, living in a high-rise flat whose excitement was to go out with the boys, whose team bomber jacket lining was orange. And so you entered this extraordinary installation through a turnstile, as though you too were going into a kind of orange haze and into a football match. And on the wall, you see a cast of his brother's trousers. It's called Well Washed, the very cast in plaster, the very, very day his brother at one of these football matches was stabbed in the leg. So he's coming into this rather restricted gallery art scene, which I think is an experimental crucible as opposed to the street, with that experience behind him. Next one, please. And this is an installation shot giving you some form, and the two sculptures I'm going to talk about again. Next one, please. So what is interesting about the sculpture on the right, which is called this is a lead cast of the stadium football terraces. I like the very beautiful way that this riffs on modernism and postmodernism and the bronze sculpture and the sculptural plinth. And the next two, please. Next one. And this one here is so interesting because it's cast of a Soviet army helmet as worn by the Polish police force when they're policing football demonstrations and beating people up. Very, very useful repurposing of Soviet army helmets. And his own knitted balaclava that he put on, of course, to look anonymous when he was a football supporter. Next one, please. So he has also kept a lot of photographic evidence of all this, and he had a very marvelous video screening of pixelated photographs in which the focus would change all the time, and you didn't know which crowd, as it were doing what. You know, who were the victims, who were the perpetrators, who were the police. I'm not going to play you a video, which I could, but it kind of sparkled and gave animation to the installation. And next one, and he kept his own photo journals of his research using police surveillance as well as footage. And he was inspired not by the people I've been talking about, but interestingly enough, in terms of the conference, by a book published in 1967, taking us back to the other dark side of the Summer of Love, Raymond Momboisse's Riots, Revolts and Insurrections, which was interestingly enough reviewed at that time in 1967 in conjunction with a book called Prelude to Riot, A View of Urban America from the Bottom, taking us back to the behavior of the so-called, and in this case, American underclass. So there are lots of issues there that are going into this displaced Polish, now artist's agenda when he makes the exhibition. Next one, please. That's a next one. I think the popular art is the popular art of the football pitch, personally. You see the orange here of the orange football supporters. Next one, please. And this is his performance called Hooligan in his Brussels gallery this is a photographic record of him actually smashing the gallery up like a footballer. But like a football hooligan, not like a footballer. But what I think is interesting here is physiologically how he would be reliving the mixture of adrenaline and testosterone and so forth that he had before he was an artist, and is kind of harnessing those and bringing those into the gallery space. So on to Ewa Axelrad, and what is interesting here is the change to a female artist and how she addresses, oh, that's some Polish hooligans for you, which we saw in the last one as well. And in this very terrible climate, which all Polish emigres in England are switching back into when they watch their local news and so forth. Could I have the next one, please? She does a very, very much more calmer, beautiful, deliberately even contemplative installation. On the right is a kind of installation of flagpoles, making a kind of sine, cursine wave. And you can see on the end a still from what at the other end of the gallery is a video and this wax torso. Next one, please. That's the wave of flagpoles. Next one, please. This, as a video, is this kind of male bonding scene where they're all going around like this, getting themselves into the mood, as indeed do rugby players on the field and football players when they've scored their goal. And many of you here, although not me, must know what this feels like. But this is the sort of image that she was using, juxtaposed with the piercing of that wax torso in the video. So you see this pierced body, which inevitably evokes religious imagery, the piercing of St. Sebastian, for example. And next one, please. And very movingly, this placing of a finger into a wound on the torso. One doesn't know if this is a female, a female version of a gesture which of course recalls doubting Thomas in the Bible. So she's bringing this Catholic, highly contested Catholic imagery into her work, but in a way which I think is infinitely complex and sensitive, in a way which distinguishes art from propaganda. I do want to talk about that difference, and which also implies the vulnerability of these male individuals, or singularities, if you like to use the word we were thinking about this morning. Next one, please. She also produced these very, very small scale, very delicate little implements on a rack that looked like almost toothpicks, but they are actually bearing the different fascist insignia in the plural of the people on those fascist strikes. And she says herself in her gallery brochure that these are actually the insignia for these demonstrations. And suggests the brotherhood of arms. So, of course, I'm not speaking, next one please, I'm not speaking from the point of an imperialist or a Brit or somebody talking about Polish people. I want most specifically to say how in Britain over the last 2 or 3 years we've been sharing these disturbing things, sharing fascist insignia when we see news of our own right-wing demonstrations, how we have this similar types of racism, not Polish anti-Semitism, but very strong racism in the country. We have women artists and women involved, as you saw in the last slide. Sorry, my gestures are getting a bit ambiguous, don't change. And the violence. This is violence outside Westminster, and as you know, well, as some of you know, Boris Johnson has put in a huge budget for police control for the violence which he anticipates at the moment when we move out of the market. Well, there will be violence, of course, and it's getting very, very, very bad. So this is about Britain at the moment as much as it's about Polish artists, and one Polish artist whose status is now severely menaced. Next one, please. I'm ending. Next one, please. Woohoo! Right, so we get back to the concept of is everything just symptomatic, or do you need a mastermind? This is indeed Dominic Cummings himself out of the closet at the recent This Week Tory Party conference, where Get Brexit Done was the logo. And I want to throw 2 more slides at you for contemplation. This is the fact that we can't just talk about politics and populism without leaders who are not necessarily wonderful leaders, but people in whom things crystallize, who can give voice to things and who actually lead, you know, like the Führer. So we know that there is a problem to do with personalities. My last piece by Ewa Axelrad, a very, very light, fluffy, a very, very light little puffer jacket. It's called Gorilla. It's asking, who is the arsehole here? I think after the last paper, I think Dominic Cummings could do with an anal sex workshop. It might solve our nation's problems. And last of all, yes, we're going to all go on the streets again, ordinary middle-class people, intellectuals, protesting against Brexit on October the 19th, if not indeed before. It was the tediousness down here that is spurred the slogan, get Brexit done, brutal ruin of economies, xenophobic, intolerant tediousness. And of course, the last time I came to Berlin, could I possibly imagine that I would be giving this paper just such a little time ago? I've said here, tedium, get Brexit done, is now a very great danger, not just for us all, but our European friends, the Europeans living in Britain, the Polish artists living in Britain, of course, the British living in Europe, and the whole post-war, Cold War consensus of the whole body politic. Thank you.